Coming up on this week's edition of NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen.
We'll explore the growing trend of beef on dairy, a practice that's gaining popularity. Our panel of experts will discuss the benefits and challenges this trend presents to the beef cattle industry.
And now, NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen.
Hello and welcome to NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen. I'm Kevin Ochsner. Thanks for joining us. Technologies, including genetic testing and sex semen, have enabled dairy producers to think differently about their genetic and management decisions. Thanks to these technologies, the feeder cattle coming from dairies look a lot more like their beef counterparts due to the growing number of dairy producers incorporating beef cattle genetics. These cattle, commonly referred to as beef on dairy crosses, have helped keep feed yards and meat cases full during a time of record low beef cattle numbers. Today, I'm joined by a knowledgeable group of people who can shed some light on this industry trend. Key Jim, he's Senior Lead of Animal Agriculture at TELUS and Managing Director for GK Jim Farms. Next, we have Ryan Peterson, General Manager of Five Rivers Feed Yards in my home state of LaSalle, Colorado. And finally, we have Patrick Linnell, Director of Market Research for CattleFacts. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us today. Based on the numbers I read from the National Association of Animal Breeders, it appears that somewhere between 30-35% of the semen that dairies are purchasing is actually beef semen. I'm curious, are those numbers accurate, and what's driving this trend, Patrick?
Yeah, Kevin, that's exactly the information that we look at as well, as we've seen this surge in beef on dairy growth in the past few years. And it's clearly been just a big profitability signal and a margin signal to the dairy operator, especially at today's values at $900 or $1,000 for a day-old beef dairy cross calf. There's a huge amount of incentive there for them to switch to adopting that practice over just a traditional fed dairy animal. And not to mention the signals through the system. It's frankly a high quality product, as I think we'll talk about a little bit later. In this period of tighter beef supplies, that's what the market wants. So there's that system all the way through, or that signal rather, all the way through the system.
So fundamentally, do you have any sense of how that's impacting dairy producers' profitability in this current market environment?
It's a clear boost to profitability. And I think that was especially important a few years ago when milk prices and milk margins were really struggling. That was a very key revenue source. And now today, it boosts, it's certainly another boosting factor.
Yeah. We're fortunate to have a couple of cattle feeders, large-scale cattle feeders with us. And I'm curious, Ryan, how has it impacted you as a cattle feeder and the cattle feeding industry at large?
Well, Kevin, I think it's been a really good impact. I mean, anytime we can bring a segment of the feeding cattle population into the yard with a very different value proposition for us in terms of improvement, I think that's something that we can get kind of excited about. The dairy population has always been a contributor to cattle on feed. We're not changing the number of cattle that are coming into feed yards with beef on dairy genetics. We're simply taking them and really doing a 180 on what they bring to the table. We're improving their efficiency, we're improving their performance, we're changing the carcass conformation, we're not worried as much about maybe height restrictions that we can get into on dairy animals. And all of that bodes really, really well in terms of our system of trying to keep costs low when we're putting those cattle all the way through from start to finish and delivering a good quality product to the packing plant. So I think it's something that we get excited about when we can say, we've taken something that traditionally maybe looks at it from the feeding perspective as a discount to now is on par with really good quality in terms of genetics and finished cattle and what they bring to the table.
Yeah, Dr. Jim, add to that and also pick up on his last comment about how the value of these cattle have changed or how you look at them differently as you compare them against native beef cattle and what that's meant to your feeding operation.
I think, as was previously mentioned, the Holsteins have always been a significant part of the fed cattle system, somewhere between 17 and 22% of all fed cattle, right, have come from, the dairy system.
Right.
So I think a lot of people forget that. This is not changing the total number of animals available for the feeder supply. It's changing the breed composition of the feeder cattle. And the utilization of beef cattle genetics is obviously, you're crossbreeding now, so you're improving average daily gain, you're improving feed efficiency, you're improving carcass traits, you're improving carcass composition. So you've got all of the increased value of the feeder animal. And in addition to that, you have, from a consumer perspective, a very youthful animal when slaughtered, been on a high grain diet for a very long period of time, right? So you have a consumer experience that's either equal or superior to the beef cattle genetics. So it's a winner all the way around, and I don't think beef producers should regard it as a threat. I mean, it's going to create the largest demand for superior seed stock across all the breeds, right? And the biggest buyers of superior seed stock is going to be the semen companies as they develop their beef on dairy programs, right? So I look at it as a win overall for the entire industry, including the feedlot industry. So it's something that we should be. It's going to be a permanent part of the landscape going forward. So it's inescapable that it's going to be with us. The question is figuring out how to best make that work for your particular operation.
I appreciate you saying that. I've often said that as long as people like cheese on their pizzas, we're going to have about 9 million dairy cows in this country, and we don't need 9 million heifers. And so there's going to be some of those cattle, half those cattle or so, going into the beef market. I'm curious, what has it meant? You said the numbers have stayed the same, but I'm curious, what has it meant in terms of the quantity of beef and or the quality of beef? I mean, we've always thought of dairy animals marbling quite nicely. What impact has it had in terms of the pounds of beef we've put on the market as well as the quality? You want to begin?
It's not changing the number of head, but it may be increasing with increased carcass weight, the total amount of beef somewhat. But that's a really hard number to get at because, for example, right now we're feeding all cattle longer. Right. So because of the market signal and the large feeding margin, right? So it's hard to say whether there's an increased amount coming from the different breed type that would theoretically be capable of making them bigger. But I might add, historically we made some of these Holstein steers pretty big as well. I see. Right. So exactly. Right. So I'm not entirely sure of how that will shake out. But in terms of quality, the beef cattle now have better marbling than on average than the straight Holstein. Gotcha. It didn't start out that way, but it became that way with selection. So we're getting more choice and prime out of the beef on dairy than we would have from the straight Holstein cattle. And in addition, that's, as I mentioned before, that's a pretty desirable animal because it's been on high grain diet for a long period of time and slaughtered when youthful.
And it's true, Ryan, that historically that dairy carcass may not qualify as a beef carcass, right? And so we're putting more muscle in that animal. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you just got two different breeds of animal, right? And so one has a carcass that's going to be a different shape, different just inherently. That's the way it's going to be. And when we get that cross in there with the beef onto the dairy, you're changing that, right? And from a consumer acceptance standpoint, just allows that animal to have a lot more market flexibility, really. And so, to Key's point, I mean, we've seen what these beef on dairy cross cattle can do when we hang them up, and what grades they can achieve and reach. And that's pretty exciting when we have a consumer base or consumer population that has not really shown they haven't let up on the demand for high quality, good tasting beef. And so when we can have more animals reaching the choice and prime category, that's just a really good thing for our industry.
If I could extend on a couple of those comments, as we look at it, I completely agree with the point that it's important to remember about 20% of beef production has always come from the dairy segment. Gotcha. But in that vein, we see where there are a few numbers that have likely been added to the system through the use of beef on dairy. Okay. You mentioned one of them, just the tightening up of the replacement heifer system, running a lot tighter ship there because of that alternative value. And then the continued decline of veal slaughter. Again, those animals turning into a beef dairy cross that continues all the way through the system and produces a high quality product for the consumer. And then to Key's point about adding carcass weight. But I think the important thing that we look at is that the market has no problem clearing high quality beef. We've rolled up the quality, and at the same time, we've achieved record prices across all classes of cattle and beef. The consumer just wants high quality beef, and this is just providing them what they want.
To satiate their appetite, indeed.
Exactly.
It's a great conversation. We have a lot more ground to cover, including a look at how these beef on dairy calves could impact beef producers. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Grazing and pasture management is really the critical first step in our cow-calf operation. Without good quality pastures, good quality forage, it'd be really tough to make it with a cow-calf operation.
Mark your calendar for an important event, the Cattle Industry Summer Business Meeting. Cattlemen and women from across the country will gather to set policy priorities, discuss critical issues, and get a first look at the beef industry long-range plan. Don't miss this opportunity to collaborate with your fellow industry leaders to help shape the future of the beef cattle industry. The Cattle Industry Summer Business Meeting, July 7th to the 9th in San Diego. Register now at ncba.org.
Welcome back to this special edition of Cattlemen to Cattlemen as we discuss beef on dairy and what it means for beef cattle producers. My understanding is that there has been a change in value, as we discussed, on these beef on dairy cross calves versus the Holstein or Jersey calves traditionally. Dr. Jim, I mean, what is that value? How does that value compare to native beef calves?
Well, if you start at the day old and look at the spread in price of day olds between a Holstein bull calf and the crosses,
yes,
depending on, of course, many market factors, it can be in the range of $200 to $300 per head as a day old. As a day old. So it's a reflection of the improved carcass traits, the improved feed efficiency, and the improved gain. Right, you impute all of those together. Right, and it produces a pretty significant difference in cost of production and also in selling price of the animal.
And what about the comparison between that beef on dairy versus a native beef calf?
Well, I think we can look at there's some data starting to appear there, and if you can believe it at times, right, as this thing evolves, those spreads at 300 and 400 pounds have been remarkably close. Now, they shouldn't be that close, but it's just a function of an evolving market where I would submit that the B&D calves have been overvalued, right, at various points in time. But, typically that spread you would have better data on that, but looking at it, but I'd say over the last while, that 400 pounds is between a $25 and $35 spread. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly what we were looking at as well. At that 4 and 5 weight, maybe $50 a head.
Yeah, and so again, my opinion is I still think that's too much. It's not enough, actually. The spread's not enough.
The spread's not wide enough.
As people get more experience in feeding the cattle, and it's a function of we're overvaluing every feeder animal on the planet at this point in time.
To fill some feed yards.
Right, to fill a feed yard. Yes. So it's just a relative thing. But there's no question that fundamentally they have more value than the straight Holstein. But they should not have as much value as the straight beef cattle. Right. I mean,
just they're different animals. And I'd ask you, Patrick, relative to the behavioral change that's created for dairy producers, it's kind of changed their game in terms of how many replacement females they're keeping, has it not?
It's changed the math quite a bit on the replacement heifer system. And especially if you jump back to 2022 and early 2023 when milk margins were struggling, as we said, that incentive to produce that cross calf, I think, resulted in some breeding decisions where they maybe overshot the runway on breeding, adjusting too much of the herd to a beef dairy cross and didn't produce enough replacements. So where we're left today is a replacement heifer shortage on the dairy side. And so ironically, as you look down the road, we may actually tighten up this beef on dairy supply by a small degree as we just try to produce a few more replacements to stabilize that dairy herd. No, to be fair, it's not like the beef on dairy trend is going away, but could we tighten it up a few head? I think that's probably an expectation that we'd have.
Yeah. Ryan, I'm curious, what's different? What are some of the challenges and issues feeding these beef on dairy calves versus the native cattle?
Certainly, Kevin. When we first started seeing these beef on dairy crosses hit hit the market, in the feeder calf market in a bigger volume setting, I think we kind of thought, well, this is a beef animal because it's maybe a solid cuddler and has beef genetics. It's a beef on dairy, and so maybe that's where our head went. Or is it, it's coming from a dairy origin, right? From a dairy or a calf ranch to the feed yard, and so what bucket are we going to try to put them in from a cattle feeding perspective? As complex as feed yards can be, we really want to try to keep them as simple as possible. And so when I think we first got started, we're trying to decide, what's going to be the easiest way to start these cattle on feed? What's going to be the best way to acclimate them to a feed yard? How are we going to process them into the system and get them, inoculated and tagged and everything coming through? And what we quickly found was, it's not going to be that simple. They're going to carve out kind of their own little spot where they need to be in terms of how we transition on feed. What types of methods or animal handling techniques are going to be best, because these animals may never have seen a person on a horse try to push them up and down the feed alley and get them from a processing barn to a home pen. And so it's been a little bit different approach and if you're a feed yard that's maybe fed a lot of dairy animals already, then it's probably an easier transition for you naturally, right? But if you've only had straight native beef cattle in your feed yard and now have a pen of beef on dairy cattle, that's something that maybe you have to try to really adjust to, right?
Anything you'd add?
Not really. I think he's covered it very well. I mean, you've created a separate management class within the feed yard, and over time we adapt to. They're kind of halfway between, right? Characteristics of the Holstein, characteristics of the beef cattle behaviorally, right? And as was mentioned, if you've not fed any Holstein cattle previously and now you're in the B&D thing, then your learning curve is fairly steep, right? But if you've had Holstein cattle before, then not nearly as bad.
Gotcha. Another great discussion, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion of beef on dairy cross cattle and what the broader beef industry can learn from this trend. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Cattle producers across the country work hard to care for their animals and their land. The USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service is there to help. Find out how you can work with NRCS to develop a conservation plan for your operation. Find possible funding resources for implementing conservation practices, or get free expert advice on ways to improve your farm or ranch. Visit the website nrcs.usda.gov today.
Biosecurity is becoming more and more important in the cattle industry. Proper washout of your trailer after hauling certain classes of cattle, changing classes, or going to a different facility is all important. Changing your footwear, making sure that your clothing and your footwear is not contaminating different facilities as well. Using a side-by-side or a four-wheeler. All these things, when we go to different yards, different lots, make sure that they come back clean and not spreading disease. DQA, the right way is the only way.
The Beef Quality Assurance Program is funded by the Beef Checkoff.
Welcome back as we continue our discussion of beef on dairy cross cattle. Gentlemen, I'm just curious what we should be learning as beef cattle producers from the beef on dairy trend. It seems to me that we've got a very consistent cow base. We've got animals that are ID'd all the way back to birth, known birth dates. We track lots of information on there, and there's a lot of experiments going on there. What can we leverage and take that is going to help native beef production? Patrick?
Yeah, Kevin, I think there's a tremendous amount that we can learn just in terms of the value of intentional breeding and genetic selection tools and utilizing those tools at our disposal. This population has also advanced tremendously in the past 3 to 5 years in terms of genetics. Are there things that we can implement, again, intentional breeding and genetic programs to maintain and improve a low maintenance, high fertility beef cow herd that also produces that high quality beef product that our consumer wants?
Excellent. Ryan, what would you say?
You know, if we kind of take a step back and look at it, the beef on dairy movement from a bigger, broader context, what's really happening is we've got the technologies of genomics and artificial insemination and embryo transfer, all these things that have really been able to accelerate genetic selection and production, right, at the dairy level. We're using those in beef cattle systems too. But as those technologies become more available, or maybe a price point from their availability comes down a little bit to be more applicable in the commercial beef cattle sector, that gives us, or positions, I should say, as an opportunity when the market dictates for us to really capitalize and use that technology. And that's what I see has happened in the beef on dairy movement, where the dairyman was in a position where maybe milk prices weren't as good, but there's a demand for feeder cattle. We have these technologies available that we can plug in and really improve the profitability of their operation and create an offshoot product that now is just as important as the milk that they produce, right? And so could a beef producer be in that position down the road when the chance of the right economic conditions and the availability of technology come together?
Great point. Dr. Jim, what would you add?
I think what the Beyond D is going to clearly show is the true value of genetic improvement,
Okay.
right? Over time, because here there's an opportunity, to produce feeder cattle at scale,
Yes.
right? And you can, so feeding organizations can get a significant quantity of animals with specified genetics or genetics that they may own or control or want utilized. And so finally you can get a meaningful supply of the feeder animals with the characteristics you're looking for, and you'd be able to make with a closed loop system, because you can own the animals from birth through the calf ranch, through the feedlot, through the packing plant. So now you have a selection available to breed better cattle at a scale that's unprecedented in the industry, right? So now you can get rapid genetic improvement, right, in something that we've improved things over a very long period of time. Now we have the opportunity to improve it over a very tight time scale. And I'll boldly predict the day will come where the cattle that are coming from the Beyond D system will be very comparable to the cattle from the straight native beef cattle system.
Very, very interesting. Now we'll be back to wrap up our show right after this. Stay with us.
You always know where this one is. But what about this one? Or this one? Imagine knowing your machines the way you know your cattle, where they are and what they need. Data like that could make a difference. You can make better decisions for more efficiency, consistency, productivity. That's the power of technology. Get started with Operations Center today.
Welcome back. As we wrap up our program, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to share some final thoughts on the Beef on Dairy program. Dr. Jim?
Yeah, for our cattle feeding organization, the Beyond D represents probably the most significant change that we've seen in the last 40 years. It gives us the opportunity to source at scale, a large percentage of our feeder cattle, and we're involved in the entire system from the selection of the bulls to the calf ranch to the feedlot, all the way through to the packer. So for us, it's a sea change of opportunity.
Outstanding. Ryan?
Looking at it on how beef on dairy has come into a really big spotlight today, but it's not a new thing. But the economic conditions and the technologies available to dairy producers have allowed it to become something that has been a really good impact on feeder cattle supply, good quality genetics that hang up and do really well at the plant and end up with a really good product for consumers. And so there's a lot of wins across that supply chain that I think support that it's going to be here for a while.
Very good. Patrick?
I agree with a lot of those other points. For as much buzz as beef dairy cross has gotten in the last few years, the surge in adoption is likely behind us, but at the same time, it's really here to stay. It's value and revenue to the dairy producer, it's numbers through the system for the feed yard and the packing segment, and then ultimately it just provides that high quality product for our domestic and global consumers.
That's great. Thank you all for your insight into this topic. That wraps up this edition of NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen. Thanks again to our panel for their insights, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next week, right here on RFD TV.